We continue in John's Gospel. Today we're looking at John 18 and 19. A passage of real contrast as it focuses on Jesus the King, but is actually the last few hours of his life before his death on the cross. Back in chapter 3, we had some idea of Jesus as king as he and Nicodemus talk about the kingdom of heaven. And then in chapter 12, we have Jesus entering Jerusalem on the donkey, symbolic of a king, and the people crying out, Hosanna, the King of Israel. But now this heavy irony between a declaration of king and his death. Let's just look at the core stories as we go through, and then we'll look through in a bit more detail. So we start with the arrest in Gethsemane, and then we move to the trial with Jews, and then with Pilate, and then we have Pilate's sentence to death and his declaration of Jesus as innocent, and then we have his death on the cross. So let's start with the arrest, and particularly with the arrest in Gethsemane, is Jesus saying, I am he. As he says this, it is in response to the soldiers and Judas coming into the Garden of Gethsemane and wanting Jesus of Nazareth. And he basically hands himself over, surrenders himself to them. Their response to him saying, I am he, is that they fall down on the ground. Effectively an act of worship or awe at who he is and what he said. There's some massive spiritual power going on there. And so Jesus says again, who are you after? And they say again, Jesus of Nazareth. And he says, I told you, I am he. The second time he says it. Part of his emphasis in saying I am he is he wants to protect his disciples, and that becomes even more apparent in this passage. It is he who is the one to be sacrificed, not his people. He's the good shepherd who looks after his sheep. In contrast to Jesus and handing himself over, Peter comes to his just self-defense and defense of maybe the group of them as he cuts off one of the servants' ears with his sword. Jesus says, I am ready to drink the cup which the Father has given to me, the cup of suffering, the cup of God's anger. And Peter too, in contrast to Jesus, we read the story of his denial. And whereas Jesus said twice, I am he, Peter says in this story twice, I am not a disciple of Jesus. And then a third time he denies him again. You see, the servants, as they come to Peter, they wouldn't expect a disciple of Jesus to be there in the courtyard, so they phrase it in a way which expects a negative reply, and Peter takes the easy way out, which also protects himself too. How easy it is to give in to temptation in those difficult and risky situations. But then Jesus is taken to Pilate, and there's this irony of the Jewish leaders not wanting to go into the palace in order to keep themselves ceremonially clean. And yet, while they're doing that on the outside, on the inside, their heart is totally set against God and against the Messiah. Their main accusation to Pilate is that Jesus has said that he's the king of the Jews, and so Pilate asks, are you a king? And Jesus ultimately replies, yes, you're right, I am a king, but not of this world, or else all my forces would come and protect me. But actually, I don't need to go to war in that way, because my kingdom is not actually impacted by what's going on here at the moment. In fact, if anything, it's built up through it. I am the one who has the truth, he says to Pilate. Pilate's sceptical about what is truth. And then Pilate comes to that verdict. I think it's very interesting how Pilate's understanding of who Jesus is changes, I think, during the course of the conversation between him and Jesus. So he starts with that question, are you a king? But then it moves through to a mocking of Jesus as king, a heavy sense of abuse of Jesus as they put a crown of thorns on his head and they put a purple robe on him and they strike him. And then Pilate presents Jesus again to the Jewish people and says, "Here is the man." Emphasis of the humanity of Jesus. But then the Jews, they want to see him crucified, and they say to him, they say, well, Jesus claimed that he was the Son of God. At this, Pilate, I think, is becoming concerned and worried. We find some of that in the other Gospels. Who is this man? Who is this Jesus? And so he asks Jesus, where did you come from? Jesus declines to reply, and then Pilate threatens him with crucifixion, and Jesus says, well, you only have that power because it's given to you from above. And actually those who handed me over to you are guilty of a worse sin. But then he takes Jesus again back out to the people and he says, here is your king. Might have been ironic, but I wonder whether there wasn't an element of Pilate is actually thinking this is the case. They say they have no king but Caesar. That's a strange thing for the Jewish leaders to say because they were not particularly supportive of the Roman occupation. But then, amazingly, Pilate writes the label, the sign to go on the cross, and it says, Jesus of Nazareth, the King of the Jews. The Jewish leaders object and say, shouldn't you say he claims to be the King of the Jews? And Pilate simply says, what I have written, I have written. A statement of, this is it, this is the way it lies. So then, we move on to the death of the king. And John's emphasis in this is that it is fulfilling the Old Testament prophecies. There's the clothes and the way they're treated. There's the fact that Jesus is thirsty. There's the fact that his bones are not broken. There's the fact that his side is pierced. All these things are indicated in the Old Testament. And then there's Jesus' heart of compassion as he cares for his mother Mary and makes sure she's looked after going forward. And then we come to that point where Jesus declares it is finished, the job is done, and the king dies. The Romans make sure he's dead, and they do that by piercing his side with a sword, and out flows the water and blood. He is certainly dead, but maybe as significant to John is when the water and the blood is that Jesus came that springs of living water would flow up within us, and the blood is the symbol of the forgiveness that he brings as the light of the world. And then they bury Jesus. It's interesting, secret believers come out of the closet in order to bury him and give him a good but quick burial. And so we're left with this in this section. Jesus, the one who has control over nature. Jesus, the one who heals. Jesus, the one who raises the dead. The Son of God who came down. The Messiah who came to rescue. The bread of life who gives spiritual energy. The light of the world who brings forgiveness. The good shepherd who lays down his life for the sheep. The resurrection of the life who now lays down his life to death. The word, the way, the truth, and the life, who sets the path. Is this the king I follow and serve? He said, I am the vine, and the question is, am I connected to this king? Do I believe that Jesus is calling me to a life of comfort and ease, or a life of sacrifice and service? This is our King.